All right, we'll start here in the global SITREP. Jared, good morning. This is very interesting. So apparently there's a leaked memo from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. They issued a warning to Israel in this memo, threatening to withhold weapons transfers if Israel does not improve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Blinken and Lloyd gave Israel 30 days to comply. And here's the interesting part. Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh said this memo was, quote, meant to be a private correspondence, and apparently it was leaked. And she kind of implied that it was leaked. This is almost certainly an intentional leaking to garner media coverage, to show that the Biden-Harris administration, they're trying to put more pressure on Netanyahu and the Israeli government, also build political and social pressure on them as well. There's another very important thing I want to cover, and these are comments from U.S. Army Pacific Commander General Charles Flynn. First of all, he confirmed that North Korea is sending fighters to Ukraine, and he said they're now getting, quote unquote, real-time feedback about North Korean military capabilities. I guess that's the North Koreans and maybe U.S. intelligence as well. He said, quote, there's some learning going on. Jared, you had also reported in the report this morning that Ukraine claims that 10,000 North Korean soldiers are currently fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. And Ukraine security services previously reported that they had killed several North Korean intelligence officers in a missile strike. Here's what I want to get your take on, because General Flynn, again, the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, talked about Xi Jinping's directive to the People's Liberation Army and their preparations for a 2027 conflict. Here's what General Flynn had to say, quote, when they say be prepared to invade by 2027, I have an obligation and a responsibility to train my force. He continues, quote, I have to ready our forces to be able to respond to that, because I see what they're doing and I hear what he is saying. And he's talking about Xi Jinping. He says, quote, I take that as a reality. One of the things that we have talked about many times, Jared, between Max, you, and I, is we don't have enough assets in the Pacific currently to fight this war. Here's this head of U.S. Army Pacific. It's not in this quote I provided, but he does say we're going to reposition our forces and build a larger forward presence in the Pacific. We've previously talked about the Chief of Naval Operations giving the U.S. Navy a directive to be prepared for potential conflict for 2027. So it really does seem like there's this whole of military, or maybe almost whole of military effort here to prepare for 2027. What do you make of his comments, and do you think we're still on track for a 27 conflict?
I think it fits right in. One thing we covered probably 2 months ago was the U.S. Air Force also restructuring, not just the Army and Navy. They're preparing to make or kind of restructure the whole thing so they have all capabilities in a single wing and be able to mass deploy that wing on an instant. So it does look like it's a whole of military approach. Obviously, the Marines will be under the Navy there. I think they are serious, though, as we covered yesterday. I don't know if China actually is prepared to really take it by 27 just due to manpower reasons. We may be preparing.
Well, but this may be a blockade in 2027, not an invasion, yes. Correct?
Yes, I think that's probably, if they take any military action, they pretty much have to try to starve out the Taiwanese, because as far as I could tell, I don't think anyone's ever been able to successfully take Taiwan. There was one battle over it back in 1895, but there was a diplomatic handover ahead of time. So it really looks like we're preparing for just covering tyranny of distance by, again, forward deploying everything, and then really trying to bring in everybody in the region around Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. All right. Also, I want to point something out. I don't track Taiwanese officials for a living, but I did find this interesting. And Jared, maybe you have a better baseline on this than I do. Former Taiwan President Tsai is in Brussels, Belgium this week. She's actually on a tour of a few different European countries, trying to build European support for Taiwan. I thought that was interesting. You know who was also in Brussels this week is U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He's attending the NATO Defense Ministerial Meeting He's also attending the first ever G7 defense ministers meeting. They have never met. There's never been a defense minister meeting among the G7 countries. I thought that was interesting. That's also taking place in Europe. And it just seems conveniently timed that Tsai is in Europe trying to build support for Taiwan. And so it's unclear. I didn't see them meeting on any of these schedules. It's unclear whether Tsai is going to meet with Lloyd Austin or other defense officials, either on the sidelines of the NATO meeting or this first ever G7 defense ministers meeting. It's also interesting. Tsai is actually going to be traveling to the United States following this European leg. I believe she'll be in the U.S. about next week. And this is going to anger the Chinese, obviously, because the newest Taiwanese president, Lai, has also scheduled a trip here to the United States later this month. So I'm just seeing a lot of movement from Taiwan here. And this former president's trip to Europe was planned by the Taiwanese, or planned in part by the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense. So I haven't seen the list of her attaches, if there's defense attaches there. I'm assuming there are. But it really does look like this is Taiwan trying to build military support or try to get some kind of military cooperation from NATO and G7 countries. Do you think that's off baseline? I mean, do you read anything into that, Jared?
No, I think that's perfectly on brand, especially when you look at Tsai she was the former president, but her VP was the current president. So they have a very close working relationship. She may be there as an informal representative. One other thing for this the NATO defense ministerial meeting, Mark, the new Secretary General, he announced that Japan and South Korea would be attending for the first time ever. So I think there's a lot of interplay here that's going to go on behind the scenes about how we actually defend Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. And that South Korean and Japanese defense officials, I believe, were both at the NATO summit in Madrid. Was it either 2022 or last year? But so point is, a multi-year process of incorporating, and actually NATO officials have been in South Korea specifically to work on military interoperability between NATO countries and South Korea, part of this big global NATO strategy. All right, let's move on to Ukraine. You've got this big update about Ukraine is now, I guess they have been, but now really formally requesting NATO membership. What's going on?
Yes, this is coming from Ukraine's ambassador to NATO. She announced that Ukraine is asking President Joe Biden to formally invite Ukraine into NATO membership before the end of his term as part of Ukraine's victory plan. And in a separate engagement, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that an immediate implementation of the victory plan would end the war with Russia by next year. So it looks like they're making a giant push for it. But also on the last leg of an outgoing president's term.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, Zelensky, I mean, as many people have said now, we've also said on the show, Zelensky sees the writing on the wall. He says the gravy train's not going to last forever, especially if Trump gets elected. It really seems like he's got a fire lit under him now to prepare for the next eventuality, which does appear to be some kind of major ceasefire negotiations. Also, the United States announced that UK, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands would join 4 Pacific nations to enforce United Nations sanctions on North Korea. Do you see this as maybe another big driver of why North Korea, and listen, North Korea does this stuff. And the problem is, and I think it's so far, we've not had any major escalation that has turned into an actual armed conflict, return to armed conflict, because the Koreans never made peace with each other. However, do you see this as maybe something that could tip North Korea into action?
I think there's a lot of potential for that, especially because the sanctions regime was not actually renewed. It was vetoed by Russia on the Security Council there, which Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State, actually even said, hey, yes, we're doing this because Russia vetoed it, so we're just going to run our own separate sanctions enforcement. So I think this may end up pushing North Korea to be more brazen about it.